I am pleased to welcome everyone to this special session on the first Quad Leaders Summit organized by Tillotoma Foundation. Tillotoma Foundation is a global organization working in the areas of international relations, financial, environmental, scientific, strategic, and defense policy. I'm Soham Das, Director, Tillotoma Foundation. The eminent speakers will discuss the significance of the first Leaders Summit of the Quadrilateral Framework that was held on 12th March 2021 with the participation of Prime Minister of Australia, Mr. Scott Morrison, Prime Minister of Japan, Mr. Yoshihide Suga, Prime Minister of India, Sri Narendra Modi, and President of USA, Mr. Joseph R. Biden. The evolving role of the Quad in the Indo-Pacific will also be analyzed in this session. We are honored to have among us Ambassador P.S. Raghavan, former Chairman, National Security Advisory Board, and former Indian Ambassador, Russian Federation, Mr. Dipanjan Roy Chaudhury, Diplomatic Editor, Economic Times, Professor Amita Batra, Chairperson, Center for South Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, former Senior Visiting Fellow, Sydney University, and former ICCR Chair, University of Edinburgh. The session would be moderated by Professor Baladas Ghoshal, Distinguished Advisor, Indian Ocean and Southeast Asian Studies, Tillotoma Foundation. Professor Ghoshal is one of the senior most and most respected scholars of Southeast Asia from India with more than 50 years of experience. Let me now request Professor Baladas Ghoshal to take the session forward.
Thank you, Soham. I think it has been a great pleasure and a privilege to be able to interact with a very distinguished panel on a subject which is really very topical and that attracts the attention not only in India, but almost all over the world. Maybe some kind of a historic event that might have impact in the future course and pattern of international relations, particularly in Asia and in the Indo-Pacific region. As I said, it's a historic event, essentially because an organization, or it could be just an arrangement or dialogue at one time, which started in 2007 between India, United States, Australia, and Japan. Remained dormant for quite some time. Maybe China was too aggressive to shut it up for some time with its demerger to all the three other countries. It was sleeping for quite some time, although from time to time, people did talk about Quad. Suddenly got a shot in the arm sometime around 2017. And it's like, the COVID, like the kind of shot that we are receiving, the vaccine, to rejuvenate ourselves in this year of crisis. I think the Quad also got a major shot in the arm with the kind of summit that we had. Interestingly, never before it happened that an arrangement of this sort, all the four leaders were able to bring out a joint statement on this particular event. And not only that, it was also a joint editorial, all the four leaders participating in it. Prime Minister Modi talked about Quad as coming of age and also a force of major global order. President Biden said that the summit went out very well. The American leaders actually said that it was an event which is going to strengthen America's hand before it meets China. As you all know, that the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor is going to meet the Chinese. I mean, they're meeting, I think, today as well as tomorrow. And just on the eve of that, to have a summit like that, it does strengthen the hands of the Americans. And apart from that, I think because of this event and also the programs that they've been talking about, I think America has also been able to reclaim some of its lost leadership in the world. And in that, I think other countries also helped to a large extent. Without India, it could not have been possible, because I think one of the things that the American president and some others are taking credit is about the vaccine diplomacy. And I think 1 million doses or a similar sort of number is going to be produced with the collaboration between these 4 countries. And without the Indian help, this, of course, it could not have been possible, and also without the help of Australia and Japan. So India's role is also quite important, not only on the question of the vaccine, but also on the question of climate. Because without India's involvement, I don't think the world will be able to succeed in terms of bringing any major change in the climate control. So India's role was also quite important. Now, interestingly, the American sort of Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor said that it is not about China. Of course, China was one of the most important thing in the discussion. And I think this China is responsible, in fact, for all this that had happened. Its bellicosity, its shenanigans, its aggressive intentions towards its neighbors, its Coast Guard law, artificial island building, and all the kind of aggressive actions that have been undertaken by China under the leadership of Emperor Xi Jinping were actually instrumental in forcing the issue, and ultimately, I think the wolf warriors made it possible for such an event. Australia was really under pressure from the Americans, and very insulting words the Chinese made regarding Australia, chewing gum under the bootstrap, and things of that sort. Kind of sort of pressure on the trade and various other kinds of, coercive actions that China was taking made it possible for these countries to bring out, or actually to make it a reality, the Quad Summit. I think there are lots of sort of opinion on this particular development. India's security and foreign policy elites are also not unanimous on this particular issue. We have also the China lovers who have been sort of very critical and have been, of course, warning that we are going to put ourselves into the lap of the United States, and all our independence, our foreign policy initiatives, and the non-alignment and all that kind of policy measures and all that used to be the hallmark of Indian foreign policy is going to be over, and India is going to bring a disaster kind of thing by joining the American team. Of course, there are trust deficits sometimes in international relations. People are sometimes not very sure about the commitment of the United States. At least in the past, on certain occasions, there had been sort of doubts to what extent America would be willing to really commit itself in this kind of venture. But I think the signals that are coming in the last couple of weeks and the statements at the highest level show that they are really taking it very seriously. And I think all the countries that are part of it would be, I think, quite interested and quite serious about making it happen, if not as a kind of institutional structure, but at least a kind of a structure which can be used as a consultative level for these 4 countries and can prepare these 4 countries to meet the challenges of China. The one point that I'd like to make before I hand it over to the other panelists, that although apart from these four countries, the European countries like France, Germany, and a couple of others would also be willing to chip into this kind of venture. But more important from my perspective, and I think from the perspective of India, is how our neighbors respond to this arrangement. Most particularly the ASEAN countries, because they're the link between the two oceans, Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. And without the ASEAN countries, we cannot make any of these things happen. If not for their strong support for this venture, but at least an implicit support for such arrangement and their indirect participation, if not direct participation, through consultation and coordination of efforts in terms of the major issues that impact the Indo-Pacific region. So I think we have to think in terms of evolving a strategy by which we could sort of involve at least countries like Vietnam and Indonesia, which are already making some sort of gestures towards India in terms of identifying the issues that really affect the Indo-Pacific region and how that should be addressed. So that's one point that needs to be taken into consideration, that the neighbors' participation is very, very important. The second important thing to my mind, and the reason to my mind again why Professor Amita Batra is here, is that the real meat in any kind of arrangement today in the period of globalization comes from the economic factors. Now, unless the economic issues could be brought into kind of an understanding between these four countries, and through economic measures could involve the other participating countries, I don't think such a venture cannot succeed to the extent that you would like to make. So with this preliminary remarks, I think I'll shift it to first. I'll request Ambassador P.S. Raghavan, who had extensive experience in the diplomatic service and who is in the know of things because of his sort of being the chairman of the National Security Advisory Board and also in the decision-making process of India. I think he would be the best person to throw some light on some of the issues that we could really sort of deal in this particular discussions. Ambassador Raghavan.
Thank you, Professor Ghoshal. First of all, thank you very much, and the Tillotoma Foundation for inviting me to this discussion. It's good to share the stage with distinguished fellow panelists as well. You've actually done a pretty panoramic coverage of the issues involved in this exercise, and it's also both the hopes as well as the concerns arising out of this. But let me start by saying what I believe is are the signals that we got from this meeting of the Quad. As you say, it is the first ever time that the Quad met at the summit level. It's also the first ever time that the Quad issued a statement. And both these are pretty unique occurrences. But I would say, from the Biden administration's perspective, from the US perspective, that they should have organized this summit so early on in their term, and just before, as you pointed out, just before the very major meeting that they plan to have, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State plan to have with the Chinese in Alaska. I think it was meant to reassert American interest in the region, there were beginning to be doubts when the campaign was taking place. People noticed that Biden rarely mentioned, if ever, mentioned Indo-Pacific. Most of his officials didn't either, and even during the transition period. So they needed to reassert the interest and to say that, look, we continue to believe that this is a region of focus for us. In that sense, they had to very gently also signal that they were going to follow the Trump policy on China. In fact, Secretary Blinken said at one of the very first press conferences that, President Trump was actually right on China, on the threat China posed, except that he went about it the wrong way. In fact, in his formal statement also, I think he put it very, very strongly. In fact, belittling the threat from Russia in a sense, saying that several countries, including Russia, Iran, and North Korea, present the US with serious challenges, but relations with China are the biggest geopolitical test of the 21st century. And they will be competitive, collaborative, and adversarial depending on circumstances. So they set out the stage regarding China very clearly. And this meeting of the Quad, I think at this stage, at very early stage, was meant to be, among other things, also a reassurance to its Quad partners. All the Quad partners had gone out on a limb somewhat with Trump in their rhetoric on the Quad. Australia, even to the extent, as you pointed out, Australia to the extent that it attracted sanctions from China, economic sanctions from China for having dared to say that you need an independent investigation on the causes of the coronavirus. So it was a reassurance to the Quad partners that America is not going to leave them out on a limb after having taken them all up this path.
True.
So that was, but there was also reassurance at other levels. There was a much softer tone, and this is something that Biden administration has signaled, a soft, even where they're following Trumpian policies, a much softer tone about the manner of their following. And this, again, I think reassured both the Quad partners and others. You see, the Trump Indo-Pacific strategy was framed in, and I think the Department of State document said it was framed in the context of a confrontation between free and repressive world orders, the free world and a repressive state, or something like that. And then the strategy of the Pentagon said, they spelled out a military posture, lethal force presence, and so on. Now, both these documents the Biden administration has archived, actually, pending their own reformulation of the national security strategy and Indo-Pacific strategy. So this softer tone, not framing the issue in terms of containing China, and that is what, by the way, enabled the statement. The reason why the Quad could not issue a statement in the last many occasions is because we could not reconcile the American aggression with our natural caution. And I say our, I don't mean only Indian, Japanese, and Australian.
Right.
Because once again, all three of us have a very strong economic interlinkage with China. China is a very strong military presence in the region. And we do not want to frame the Quad as a containing structure, not like a nation NATO, as many people have said. So I think that was the, and by the way, the Quad originally started out by being a quadrilateral security dialogue. We don't use the word security dialogue anymore. We've not used it for a while. In fact, and neither do the Japanese or the Australians. You could see it occasionally in American writings during the Trump period. So that also, you need to get that out of the system so that it's just Quad. It's not a quadrilateral security dialogue. And also, if you see the statement, they talk about inclusiveness. And there is yet another, you talked about how our neighbors, meaning the ASEAN and others, would react to this. There is also a reassurance to them. You'll see the joint statement talk about ASEAN centrality. Of course, ASEAN centrality nowadays is a mantra. Everybody is has to say it. It's like motherhood and apple pie. But basically, ASEAN centrality is what you might call geographical fact, but political fiction. because the ASEAN simply are not united enough to talk about centrality. But the other phrase that was added to this statement is a very important phrase. It said that we reaffirm a strong support, of course, for ASEAN unity and centrality, as well as ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And this is a very important phrase, because the ASEAN published its outlook on the Indo-Pacific, where it clearly expressed its preference for non-confrontation between America and China. Basically, what the ASEAN is saying is, don't make us choose between America and China. We have a political security link with one and an economic dependence on the other. So the statement here, that is very significant. It is significant from the point of view of all four of the Quad countries, that we will pursue our cooperation in non-confrontationist terms, in terms that will not force countries to choose between America or the American partnership and China. I think that was an important reassurance as well. And finally, you know, the whole title of the joint statement, it said spirit of the Quad. It is invoking the idea that brought Quad together. It was the tsunami that brought the four countries together for disaster relief and humanitarian assistance. And now you're talking about a different kind of tsunami, the COVID, which will which the countries will join together and promote relief and cooperation in vaccine research, vaccine rollout, etc., etc., etc. So that linkage between of cooperation in on issues that actually concern everybody, not merely America's strategic goals in the region. I think that was also cleverly thought out. I think I've covered the points that you have mentioned. You, of course, if I'll also answer this question that you said about people worrying about India aligning themselves too much with America and not. I think I'm not in the decision-making apparatus, by the way, anymore, for quite a while now. But if you see the statements made by our foreign minister in particular, but a number of others, it's very clear we are saying that we are not non-aligned. Of course, non-alignment in any case died with the Cold War. It's a Cold War concept. But the freedom of choice, or what he said something else about, he put it slightly differently, but with which non-alignment signified continues to be part of our autonomy of action. Autonomy of action that non-alignment signified continues to be part of our policy. And let's look at it this way. The Quad, from our perspective, is a group of countries whose support we appreciate in the region, but we also are, and you mentioned it also, are strengthening our relations with countries like Vietnam and even other countries like, you read the news report, I think yesterday or the day before, about the sale of BrahMos to Philippines. Now, whether it goes through or not, it's a signal. So it is a number of other actions that we are taking in the region in order to protect our interests. And eventually, it's not America that's going to save us militarily, it's our own navy. So we need to build our own navy as well in the whole process. But outside of all that, Quad, America, Japan, Australia, all of them are part of a maritime strategy of India. But India also has this whole northern Eurasian mass use. You worked in Russia, you told me some years ago. You have this entire Eurasian landmass up top, dominated by China and Russia. We do not as yet have the same cooperative arrangement with the US to protect our interests there. So we do have to look elsewhere. So it's while this is an alignment with, alignment is the wrong word. While this is a partnership that is critical to us and very important to us, it's also important for us to forge other relationships. So, you're not looking at alignment, you're looking at a joint venture. A joint venture means you share, you progress on shared interests and pursue other interests with other partners wherever you have convergence with them. I think I've already said too much, but I think I've covered the canvas.
Sure. Now, before I shift to Dipanjan, first Dipanjan and then to Amita, I think I'll ask another question to you, Ambassador. Some people are also saying that the Quad is always, identified with the Indo-Pacific concept. Now, some people are suggesting that there may be some conflict of kind of conceptually between the two, because Indo-Pacific, the idea is free, open, inclusive Indo-Pacific, freedom of navigation and various other things. Now, whether any kind of sort of, arrangements like Quad does, conflict with the whole ideas of Indo-Pacific that all the countries are subscribing to. That's one point, if you could sort of give an answer to that. And the second, I think I'll make a comment on your, ASEAN centrality and ASEAN helplessness in this sort of international quagmire, if I can say that. Now, while during the Trump administration, one would see that the ASEAN countries were extremely sort of worried that the entire understanding between the United States and China that made their centrality possible in any kind of arrangement was breaking down, that US and China were heading for a clash of interest and they're going for a conflict. And in fact, if you see the statements of Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Hsien Loong, in 2 lectures in Washington, he in fact even pleaded to the United States that for heaven's sake, give China a role in the emerging world order, and so that we don't get disturbed. Now, that particular sort of feeling among the Southeast Asian countries, that by giving certain sense of ownership in this emerging strategic order, they will be able to rein in China. I think that hope has gone down quite considerably in the post-pandemic period. In fact, recently I wrote a piece in Times of India where I quoted extensively from a report that was brought out by Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, Singapore, where they have been saying that despite this, what you call cloud and land kind of diplomacy by China with all kinds of charm offensives and all that, the trust quotient of China has gone down drastically. And they have been saying that, in fact, the trust quotient for the United States have gone up quite considerably, maybe because of the Biden administration. But even in countries like Cambodia, which is practically a client state of China, where they found that the proportion of people who are talking in favor of China has gone down, and in favor of America, it has gone up. And in fact, in that report, there is also a comment that this is forcing some of the ASEAN countries to actually make a choice in their foreign policy in terms of edging. And this actually Chinese are forcing on them. Now, whether this would be manifested in actual actions or not, but what we see is that even in Southeast Asia, maybe because of the fact that they were losing their real spine and they were losing also the centrality, they now want to assert itself a little bit. But that would also, to my mind, will give an opportunity to some of the to the Quad countries, which can really calibrate their policies very subtly. It could be possible to sort of bring them into some kind of a cooperative action, not in terms of containing China, but in terms of the actual addressing some of the issues that are involved in the region. Now, if you could just make a comment on these two sort of things, then I'll shift to Dipanjan after that.
Thank you. Let me take your second point first. What you say is right, that the mood in ASEAN is shifting. At the same time, their room for maneuver is very limited.
Right.
They have this dominant power right next to them and a superpower rather distant, number one. Number two, the proximate power has a kind of economic presence which is dominating. And eventually the economic presence is what scores. I mean, if the leadership of every country lives or dies on its economics. It doesn't live or die on its strategic thinking. So there is a limit to which they can. You look at what they're doing with the code of conduct in the South China Sea, for example. They have not been able to do a single thing about it. Now, of course, there are countries like Vietnam and now Philippines, which is beginning to show, Indonesia as well, which are beginning to show slightly greater independence. But even there, it is very strictly limited by their economic possibilities. China can shut off the economic tap and these countries will be down on their knees. If China can do it to bigger countries, can do it certainly to these smaller countries. So, however, I did mention that even this particular document, the joint statement of the Quad, does hold out this olive branch to ASEAN and does kind of reassure ASEAN that, look, we would like to act in a manner that doesn't force you into conflict with one or the other. And that, I think, is a good diplomatic move. That particular phrase is a good phrase which sends a signal to ASEAN. And the idea would be, as you very correctly said, to co-opt ASEAN countries into applying pressure on China to not, to use the Middle Kingdom analogy, not to roll over its neighbors, but to treat them with just a little bit more consideration. So this is the whole concept, and I think the Biden administration that way has signaled a very significant change of tone.
Yeah,
that difference into trying to do, as he said, as Blinken said, we'll be cooperative and collaborative wherever possible, competitive wherever necessary, and adversarial if unavoidable. I mean, something like that. So anyway, so that's as far as ASEAN goes. But ASEAN is concerned, but there's a limit to which it can express its concern. Let me put it that way.
Sure.
Now, to talk about the Indo-Pacific concept and its clash or otherwise with Quad, I think we are starting at shadows, very simply. Because the Indo-Pacific, is a geographical concept. Except that, of course, the American geography is different from Indian geography.
Right.
America looks at the Indo-Pacific as east of India, and we look at the Indo-Pacific from Africa to America.
True.
But that apart, I mean, we're willing to go along with the American definition for the kind of initiatives that are being taken in the Quad. See, what are we saying? And if you go back to what the Prime Minister said in Shangri-La in 2018, we are not looking at the Indo-Pacific as a strategy or even as a concept in other than geography. But what we want in the Indo-Pacific is not inconsistent with what the Quad is asking for. You want freedom of navigation, you want lack of coercion, all these things that was mentioned in this rule of law, freedom of navigation and overflight, peaceful resolution of disputes, democratic values, territorial integrity. Now, there's no conflict between wanting that for the Indo-Pacific and wanting that in the Quad. So to talk about them as two separate or even trying to compare one on the other is not really relevant in my view. The Quad operates these four at the level of these four countries. They talk about the Indo-Pacific, and there are references to the Indo-Pacific in this document as well. But I don't see any conflict in that. Essentially, we are looking for a cooperative order in the region, and that region is by these four countries defined as the Indian and Pacific Oceans east of India, and we would like to define it as including from the African coast onward. That's all right, but the objectives are the same. All it means is that for us, we need to make a different set of arrangements for the Indian Ocean west of India, because we have different interests from all these countries in that. I would say that. Thanks.
No, I personally also don't see any clash, but I was only trying to pick up some of the writings that I've come across since the summit. And I thought I would give at least some amount of attention to them also. Otherwise, they might think that it is a kind of a dialogue between the same converts or something of that. Anyway, now having said that, I think now I'll shift to Dipanjan. Your views on how do you look at it? And also, if possible, if you could, because we haven't touched that particular issue as yet, which is the issue of technology sharing, because that's also one of the sort of programs, or at least agenda in the agenda of the 4 countries, technology development and all that. So if you could also give some comment on that. Okay.
Thank you, Professor, for inviting me for this. There are three very senior people and 3 very more experienced people than me in this panel. I'm the junior most in terms of everything, in terms of experience as well as in handling all these issues. And
sometimes the younger ones have some perspectives. With the older ones, it doesn't come into their.
No. I would
anyway.
I would first concur with Mr. Raghavan in certain things that the formulation of the joint statement is not something which is some would like to describe it as sort of the last step before a formal alliance or closer ties with the US. But the joint statement itself left a lot of space for what we call inclusivity, and I think that some of like Japanese in particular are wondering what does this inclusivity mean. That's what I hear from them after the Quad Summit, because section of them feel that whether China would be part of that inclusivity or not. But as Mr. Raghavan pointed out, as it was mentioned by Prime Minister in 2018 that that Indo-Pacific for India, it's an inclusive concept. And I believe there's space for everybody in this. And so you'd see that when there'll be cooperation between Quad and European countries, and France is one such example, because it has strategic interest as well as it has real geography, it has territories from the Western Indian Ocean to the Pacific, right? Need not be an expansion, as far as I understand, as of today, to include France. Neither if France in per se may be interested because of its own strategic autonomy concept. It would rather look for such kind of cooperation as it's happening now, that 4+1 or Malabar +1 exercise led by France. UK, I believe, is very much interested, but I'm not too sure how many members are interested in UK at this stage. At least certainly not from where we are sitting. I can, as far as my understanding goes, to have UK in this because there is a colonial legacy, and there is a way that UK, the military had looked at the world or South Asia, or still looking at South Asia from a different perspective. I don't want to get into that now, but there would be some reservations, I understand, on including UK into that. ASEAN Centrality, you would know, and Ambassador Raghavan had spoken, and Professor Batra would also know, but when the first meeting of the Quad started in 2017, I think India was the one who spoke about ASEAN Centrality, and countries like Singapore, Indonesia, even Vietnam had expressed some kind of worry that, why are the others not talking about it? And then slowly over the years in 2018, 19, the US started including, the ASEAN Centrality to it. If you look at the joint statement a little more carefully, there's a mention of South China Sea and there's a mention of East China Sea. And interestingly, there's no mention of line of actual control there. And I wrote also yesterday, as I understand that this is, and India was not keen because it's more of a bilateral issue. There's no international kind of freedom of navigation which is possible in this landmass for others to jump in. And I would concur with Mr. Raghavan, for Eurasia, we need another partner to rebalance China, and we all know who is that partner too, which has been, for the last 70 years. So, in this inclusivity concept, we need, in my opinion, Moscow in some ways in the maritime. This is the partnership, and we would also see some more plurilaterals coming, independent of Quad in this maritime space as well. If I understood correctly, it need not be a Quad partnership, but independent maritime kind of, where India will play a role, some other Southeast Asian countries and Australia will play a role. And Japan will play a role. Coming to the technology part of it, there are 3 C's which are mentioned in this as a joint working group under the Quad Summit. Critical technology is one of that, and India has been bilaterally working with Australia as well as Japan on critical technology. Last year, we signed some key MOUs with Japan for critical technology. Japan itself probably doesn't tom-tom much about its capabilities in critical technology, at least not in the international fora, unlike some of the Western countries do. We also have been, particularly over the last 1 year, have come closer to Australia in terms of developing some critical technology, or at least sharing some views on that. When Pompeo was Secretary of State, if you recall, in 2019, when he was here, he had talked about India and US can jointly develop 5G technology or not. We did not commit at that point of time. It was pre-COVID. Most importantly, there was no standoff in LSE, and there was no, Galwan incident. Of course, I would rather describe a lot of things in the post-Galwan period, in the sense, has there been an LSE standoff, but there was no Galwan? I don't think how much we would have gone in terms of a lot of these maneuverings. Simultaneously, we would still, and India is a BRICS chair, is the RIC chair this year. How much is the RIC shapes up this year in this COVID situation? I don't know, but BRICS definitely is on track. It's actually a grouping which has a secretariat, which has a bank, which is delivering on the ground. Yes, it has elephant in the room, which has the biggest share in that grouping, but it's also financing projects. So you can't really, undermine the presence of BRICS as a format where there are democracies, where there's China and where there's India's old partner, and there are talks of expansion of BRICS Bank, not BRICS per se. There are things happening on that ground in that, because there have been some of these views in India and also in China as well as US and other scholars that that this means that India is going to dilute the BRICS, which I haven't got any such signal, and probably because we are a BRICS chair and we are equally committed to BRICS, because you have to be in the room to kind of get things done and not sit outside and then kind of get things done. Pompeo, when he was Secretary of State, wanted a secretariat, was hinting more at a Asian NATO, quote unquote. That, I guess, has been diluted, by this administration. What has surprised is the pace of whether this Quad Summit could happen. But as I think most media, including me, what probably had missed the signal, because since COVID, there was monthly meeting between the Quad countries at the foreign secretary level, Quad plus also at the foreign secretary level, and these were monthly. So between, say, last May and December, there were almost, I guess, not 7, 8. There would probably be somewhere between 8 to 10 meetings, and this was coming at some point of time. A Trump administration would have definitely gone ahead and done it. Maybe they would have wanted to put more structure to it. This administration hasn't done it, but what had surprised is that they had done this within the first 3 months. It's probably to preempt the Alaska meeting, to put pressure on the Americans wanted to put pressure on the Chinese, and also I guess that Europe maybe the Europe-China investment treaty may have expedited this. The Biden may have kind of have sort of then that the Europe-China investment treaty been delayed or put on hold, this Biden may not have committed so much into Indo-Pacific at this stage. So somewhere this is also responsible, and probably Germany expedited that. There are other challenges in Europe, that's another topic. But this is where they have shown this commitment. How much will that translate into the ground? But definitely the visits of after Quad, the visit of Secretary of State and the Defense Secretary to Japan, to ROK, has given a lot of signals. And if one looks at those joint statements between US and ROK, US and Japan, There are a lot of, the way they are committed to this. Another factor into this entire is Prime Minister Suga. Prime Minister Suga is a first generation politician in Japan. He is he is a very pro-US politician. He believes that Japan's future is in the US hand, and the way the Chinese are upping the ante without occupying any territory, maybe he's preempting that if he doesn't speak now, or if he doesn't take action now, then then he might land up in a Chinese Islamicizing situation. So Suga is pushing this a lot. And just my last point, the announcement by India to see, India was the last country anyway to agree to a Quad summit, firstly, and the India's announcement of the Quad summit came within 2 hours of the Prime Minister and Suga phone call. So I don't want to draw any inference on this. This should be clear. This is not just incidental. Of course, there is this. There are these issues behind the Quad summit. Thank you.
Now, you mentioned about the BRICS, and of course, we are also part of the SCO. Yes. Now, if you go by the writings in the Global Times, although which is considered to be an official kind of a spokesperson that way, but still one can find sometimes also difference in their approaches. But as per their kind of assumptions, that this might even affect India's position in the BRICS and also in SCO. So do you find any such sort of chances of any such possibilities?
Of SCO being? Sorry, I didn't get.
In the sense that, since India is going around in this Quad,
sure,
and will the Chinese start thinking in terms of, taking some kind of a retaliatory measure in the BRICS as well as in SCO about
I don't think
India?
SCO is generally is dominated by the Chinese in terms of, the 2 languages in SCO are Chinese and Russian, and right, it's large, right. Has been, but we are in the room, because, and also Moscow has pushed that, and Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan as well to balance China in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But I don't think there'll be any dilution in the BRICS as such. In SCO, we are not yet in a position to kind of shape a lot of things, in my opinion. We, however, have dissenting voice, and that's recognized in the SCO. If you look at the joint statement, we're not part of the formulation on the Belt and Road Initiative, and then and that's open. That's the 7 countries are and the 8th country is not. But there is no conflict in that.
Yeah, I get your point. I think Ambassador Raghavan wanted to make a comment on that.
No, just a brief comment on what Dipanjan said about the languages of SCO. SCO is only one official language, and that's Russian. Chinese is not an official language of the SCO. Okay. And the Chinese have graciously accepted that. But on other aspects of SCO and so on, I'll comment later if there is time. I don't want to.
Sure. Amita?
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Ghoshal, and thank you for having, thank you to Tillotoma for having invited me to this very interesting session. I do look forward to having, I'm going to put a few questions, more than, kind of bring my own perspective to this, in the sense, taking the opportunity that we have Ambassador Raghavan here who can throw light on many aspects that I would like to point out, And here I try and bring in, some of the points that I think, I would focus on as an economist and have probably been not highlighted by the others. I pick up from where Professor Raghavan stated, in fact, everybody, all 3 speakers so far have stated, the ASEAN centrality aspect, which of course, has been mentioned as far as the joint statement is concerned. There is also an emphasis on, kind of including the emphasis on or continuing to emphasize on the ASEAN's outlook, And this is where I want to kind of bring out my first point, which I think has so far been missed, which is that as far as the ASEAN's outlook is concerned, on the Indo-Pacific, if we go back to it, carefully read it, I think it mentions very, very clearly that as far as the ASEAN's vision of the Indo-Pacific is concerned, it considers using the existing forums inclusive of ASEAN for any future dialogues, and any cooperative mechanisms. However, when we look at the Quad, it's quite separate from what is the existing forum for cooperative dialogue among these members, And that, in a way, brings out what has so far been subtly kind of understood, that ultimately the Quad is meant to contain China, Because if we talk about the ASEAN Centrality and ASEAN inclusive forums, as is the outlook, I think the more appropriate or apt forum would have been the East Asia Summit, where the others are members. We are talking about, the others, the US is also a member, Russia is also a member there, Would that have been more appropriate? Why is that not? What does it bring out for us, And does it make obvious as to what the overall objective of the Quad really is, That's my first question. And that kind of leads me to the second, where, if we look at the current timing, and the current, perspectives that are most important as far as this point of time is concerned, the key challenge that faces any country today, or around the globe, is economic recovery post-pandemic, vaccine diplomacy, and distribution, of course, is important need of the hour. But the ultimate challenge that we are all facing today is to bring economies back on track, And as far as ASEAN is concerned, how do we consider ASEAN to be a part of this? When we're talking about inclusivity, we are talking about centrality of ASEAN, How do we see coming to Quad with this kind of a subtle objective, but so tightly tied, as Ambassador Raghavan himself has stated, that linkages with China are so dense as far as this region is concerned that you cannot but think of ASEAN's progress without China. So where do we see a reconciliation between these two perspectives? One, that we talk about centrality, we talk about acceptance and emphasis of the ASEAN outlook, but we ignore the fact, that ASEAN is ultimately tied to China in such intensity, or with such intensity, that it would be very difficult to separate the two. And which also brings me to my, kind of third point, which Ambassador Raghavan has stated, that, the kind of softer tone that has been used as far as the US is concerned. I'll come to the softer tone in a bit, but the other bit, that as far as the US is concerned, this kind of Quad and the summit level meeting in a way shows the American interest, or the American, if I may use that word, pivot back to Asia, which was to a certain extent considered missing during the Trump presidency. The Trump's presidency was more bilateral. It dealt with individual countries on a bilateral level, and most significantly, it dealt with China in terms of the bilateral trade surplus that China has vis-a-vis the United States, And in this context, the Biden administration has clearly stated, in this three-word thing that they do, adversarial, competitive, and cooperative, they continue to see trade in the adversarial category, and they haven't really talked about relieving as far as any of the earlier aspects were concerned, whether it was in terms of the trade deal, renewing that, relooking at that, in terms of removal of the tariffs that were increased earlier, none of that has been mentioned so far as Biden is concerned, nor has the Biden administration in any way reintroduced the element of joining CPTPP. I'll come to that also in a moment, But in terms of reassurance, this reassurance in terms of these three this categorization into three, adversarial, the trade aspect, if continued, which it looks like will to a certain extent now, or as of now, again has an impact on ASEAN. I think this is what Trump presidency probably never brought out, or nobody ever talked about this, but it's important to understand that whatever the United States does to the Chinese, in terms of adversarial trade sanctions or trade actions, trade policy instruments, vis-a-vis China, ultimately impact the ASEAN countries, because Chinese surplus vis-a-vis the United States is a function of its deficit with the ASEAN. It imports from the ASEAN, assembles, exports. Even now, when it is upgrading in terms of its technology as well as its supply chain participation, its dependence on the ASEAN in terms of inputs, intermediate goods, sophisticated intermediate goods, continues to be. So to consider this adversarial US-China without its implications on the ASEAN, but at the same time talk about ASEAN as inclusive within the Quad, representative of the Indo-Pacific, I think there is a lot that needs to be considered or to be resolved in terms of the inherent contradictions that we see in this particular entire formulation. That's one part of my the points that I'd like to make. The second part of the points that I'd like to make is India's participation in this. Of course, as Dipanjan said, India was hesitant, last to come in, came in with the Japanese insistence and so on. But how do we, in this context, reconcile the fact, that as far as India is concerned, India's economic association with the region is very weak, and we have kind of not built upon it or not in any way strengthened it by withdrawing from the RCEP at the last minute. We are not part of a regional trade formulation. And the other trade formulation, that is CPTPP, we are also not part of that, If we have found ourselves to be wanting or to be, if you have found it difficult to participate in the RCEP, we may find it even more difficult to participate in the CPTPP, which is of much higher standards. Many of the ASEAN countries are members of both. China is a member of RCEP. China has indicated it may want to join CPTPP. And let me say that TPP, the earlier formulation that existed, in the when the United States was a member, was actually Obama's strategy, to contain China. I think that was the softer version of containing China that he brought it, as far as the region is concerned, in terms of not allowing China to dictate the rules. In fact, to follow the rules, that would be set by the TPP in the region as far as trade was concerned, which is a very, very significant component as far as this region is concerned. Now, in the absence of India, in the region that is not there in RCEP, we've actually ceded space to China, to make the rules as far as trade is concerned. And the linkages that exist, the membership that exists as far as RCEP is concerned, how do we make our presence felt, in the region? That's, in terms of India vis-a-vis United States, and the presence as far as the regional trade formulations are concerned, I'll extend that a little more to say, that as far as India is concerned, where are the FTAs or where are the trade formulations that we are trying to bring in, if at all? We have an observer status, again, as Dipanjan said, the phone calls, India, Japan, and so on. Japan's push to have India as an observer in the RCEP. Are we going to utilize that to our advantage, to make a place for ourselves in this region? I think that would be very, very important, because otherwise, Quad's economic relevance or India's economic relevance to Quad, is that much weaker, which we need to strengthen to a very large extent to play a significant role, if at all, The India-Australia FTA, it's not moving forward, although we've kind of now re-announced, we're talking about it, but we also have to accept the fact that 2 years ago, the Australians put it on the back burner, saying they're not moving ahead with it for the time being. Whether they have revived it or not, we don't know. India, Korea, this region, if we talk about as a whole, the FTA is, the CEPA is under review, India, ASEAN CEPA is under review. Where are we in the economics of the region? The economics of the region is closely tied with China. It centers around China. You can't deny that bit, How do you reconcile India's position as an equal important participant in the Quad, but its weaker relevance, or it's not that much significant relevance as far as the economics of the region is concerned? I think these are important points that we need to ponder on. And lastly, I think, I would want to say this entire bit about the softer tone as far as the joint statement is concerned, also may, to a certain extent, tell us where is it that the Quad's emphasis is really, there is no overt, explicit mention as far as containing China is concerned. Yes, the underlying, objective may be that, but there isn't any in an overt sense, The emphasis has been on something that's very soft, something that's, need of the hour, yes, vaccines, in a way, a public good perception that has been given as far as this particular formulation is concerned. The emphasis is on sharing something which is very important at this point of time. How much credence does that provide, or how much strength does that provide to the formulation in terms of its longevity, in terms of really giving it the kind of significance, strategic significance that it needs to have in the longer run? If you look at trade blocs around the world, if you look at regional blocs around the world, those that have stayed confined to only public goods, at hand within the region, if I say BIMSTEC, I think we would try and understand, where does the relevance and where does the strength get derived from in any regional formulation? It's trade, really, that gives you that kind of gravitas. Merely sharing public goods at a particular point of time, or emphasizing that, particularly those that may be relevant only to this point of time, may not really tell us where is it that the strength will be derived from in the longer run as far as the Quad is concerned. I think these are the points that I'd like to make, and have my answers. I would be consider myself fortunate to have the answers from Ambassador Raghavan, if you would please. Thank you.
Ambassador Raghavan, would you like to make any comment on this?
Thank you. Yes, I would certainly like to, number one, start with violently agreeing with Professor Batra about the importance of economic presence.
Right.
It is absolutely critical if you want to have political and strategic influence to have strong economic presence. And I did mention it in a different context. When a leader of any country has to take a decision, he will take a decision first on economic advantage and only then on political and strategic advantage, because an economic decision can lose him his next election. The political and strategic decision can only yield results 15 years later. So what she says about RCEP, I am with you. We are victims of our own. Now I'm being very indiscreet, but let me say we are victims of our own badly negotiated trade agreements.
Right.
So you do not negotiate a trade agreement properly. The other thing that we are victims of very of low ambitions. You go into an agreement without the political will to implement the reforms internally that will make that agreement succeed. Every one of our FTAs, you look at ASEAN, which is all under review, as Professor Batra said, you have a whole range of them and a whole range of others that we have tried and failed. And why have we failed? Because you keep talking about movement of personnel and you keep talking about textiles. You need to be able to back up an FTA with reforms internally that strengthen your position in that FTA. So coming to that, I think that a presence in the Indo-Pacific region and the presence in other regions as well. I think in all our FTAs, we need to take a look at it. They are under review, but I'm not sure they're under review in the right direction. You should review them to see how you can raise your ambition. And you have to have a dominant economic presence is what China has, but you need to increase your economic presence in terms of trade and investment. And services, of course, but also in terms of trade and investment in this region. So when you pursue strategic objectives like you're doing in the Quad and other such strategic objectives, you are actually weakening yourself by not having an economic arm to that effort. So I am fully in agreement with her on that. Now, about this larger issue of containing China, once again, containing China means different things to different people. What is containing China? Is it militarily containing China? Is it boxing China into its region? Is it trying to curb Chinese economic influence? So, and I think it's fair to say that if you look at the Quad, there are these 4 countries, all of them say that they're interested in an Indo-Pacific cooperative order and an Indo-Pacific security architecture. The definition of this animal by these 4 different countries is totally different. It's not the same. Broadly, you can talk about freedom of navigation, you can talk about these various, again, motherhood and apple pie, you can talk about all these objectives that everybody agrees with. But the formula of reaching there, you do not have as yet. So far, you have only expressed the will. So to call it anything close to an alliance, I think is exaggerated. And then, of course, politicians like rhetoric. So there's a lot of rhetoric that the media likes rhetoric even more. And therefore, it gets amplified. But the point is that what we want is to stop, to some extent, stop China from behaving like the bully it has been behaving. And that, I don't think there is any argument about that. The way it is behaved with not only Australia, Professor Ghoshal mentioned Australia, about the chewing gum under the shoe, but they stopped rare earths exports to Japan when Japan offended it. They put an economic embargo on Mongolia because they dared to invite the Dalai Lama. They stopped tourism to Korea because it said that it will host an American air defense system. The list goes on and on and on. It did punitive actions on Vietnam. So the idea is that can we, through this and a number of other initiatives, and Dipanjan, I think, mentioned a few other initiatives as well, can we make China behave a little bit more rationally? That is so containing China is too strong a word, and as I said, it means different things to different people. And when you talk about a softer tone, when you talk about American objectives, look, American objectives in the region, they have ebbed and flowed, but the overall objective has been the same, at least since the year 2000. You read Condoleezza Rice's memoirs about why they actually suddenly changed their policy on India. They lifted sanctions after our nuclear tests. And this whole process of going down the road towards an Indo-US nuclear deal, even that had China at its center. They basically saw China's rise as a challenge to American superpower status, and they said, let's befriend India, which is a kind of, they don't want to name it as they call it balancing China, but as a democratic ally and democratic partner in this region. So China has been at the back of everybody's mind for a very long time. But there is a difference between that and talk about containing China in an aggressive manner. And I think we need to be, so once again, so the Americans' objective is to stop China from rising to the same superpower status as itself. Our objective is to make sure that China does not dominate our region. And the Indian Ocean region, we want the Indian Ocean to remain India's ocean. Let me put it that way. The Chinese hate that expression. But anyway, this is just speaking flippantly. But basically, we want, to a certain extent, to be able to control our own destinies in the Indian Ocean. So that would be our objective. And if you can use the American keenness to stop China equaling it, well, why not? But then you have a whole lot of other, you have economic power that China has developed, technological power that China has developed. People talk about 5G. In various aspects of 5G technologies, China is actually ahead of the United States. That is the reason for the United States now coming up with all these semiconductor restrictions and so on.
Thing, yeah, of course.
Yeah, Huawei is better and cheaper than American products. There are some European competitors who can do well, but not the American, because the Americans have been sleeping on it. Anyway, so there are all these other, so there are, multiple conflicts within conflicts. And we need to be a little bit careful about how we navigate through them. But we need to pick up what is of advantage to us and take it forward. Japan has a different, you see, Japan has another outlook, which also has Russia. They still have a hostility to Russia there, which they have to tackle in terms of the American alliance. So there are every single one of them has a different objective. We need to sort of pick and choose and see how we can go with each, and it's opportunistic to a certain extent, tactical. But I again come back to what Professor Batra said. All of this will be successful only if you back it up with your own economic strength. If we do not back up all this with our economic strength, these will be ephemeral. I mean, there'll be transient advantages. Thanks. I think I don't want to say more than that.
Thank you, Ambassador Raghavan. I think I'll just chip in for a few comments on this. I also agree completely with Amita on the question of RCEP and India's weaker economic position in the region. In fact, the day India opted out of RCEP, I thought it was Indo-Pacific without India. And in fact, it has really harmed us to a large extent. Now, leaving aside that particular comment, I think I'll take up Amita's other comment about ASEAN's emphasis on using the ASEAN mechanism, that is East Asia Summit. Now, if you really want to use East Asia Summit for any kind of conflict resolution or any kind of arrangements, it will fail, because that ASEAN system works on consensus, and you can't achieve a consensus on this particular point. Now, I think ASEAN suffers also from a lot of contradictions. I mean, maybe a little sort of harsh, my comments, that they are trying to achieve something which it is impossible for them to achieve, the ASEAN centrality. The whole concept of ASEAN centrality emerged out of a convergence of interest between the United States and China. And this convergence started around 72-73 period after the rapprochement between China and the United States. And if you go through the entire ASEAN working on Confucian problem and various other issues, ASEAN always supported the Chinese position within that. And America also found it useful at that point because they wanted to bleed Vietnam. Now, this system worked remarkably well because somehow America and China found always some ground in terms of maintaining certain understanding on this particular region. But after this rise of Trump, or maybe because of the geopolitical reasons, China's own aggressive behavior and all that, and its sort of trade practices, that understanding broke down. Now, unless that understanding comes back, possibilities of which are very little, it is impossible for ASEAN as a weaker partner in this to really make any change or to play the role of a central sort of decision maker in this entire thing. Not to talk about the global kind of problems. ASEAN cannot resolve its own problems within the region. Can you give me one example where ASEAN has been successful to deal with any one issue of Southeast Asian countries that arose in the region, starting from the Hague crisis, East Timor, and currently the Myanmar crisis? Now, ASEAN has been completely ineffective. What ASEAN wants, they wanted to retain their economic sort of partnership with China, get all the benefits out of this economic trade, investment, and all that. But at the same time, they also want the others to deal with China on the question of South China Sea and aggression and all that. These two cannot be done simultaneously. The result is, if you really look carefully, the ASEAN ideas about Indo-Pacific, it is nothing but Belt and Road Initiative, rephrasing, economic cooperation, connectivity, consensus, cooperation, all that emphasis on that. So, in a situation where there are some contradictions in terms of China's position in this region, until and unless China makes certain compromises on the question of South China Sea and its aggressive behavior, and particularly after the, this passing of this Coast Guard law, which allows Chinese, fishing militia even to fire at any of the, rival ships in the region, that has really become quite impossible for ASEAN to handle the situation at this moment. So it becomes almost impossible really to deal with, to really use, ASEAN mechanisms like ASEAN Summit, East Asia Summit, to really resolve these contradictions. What can emerge, I think ASEAN should also understand that no one mechanism can really take care of all the problems of this region, of this entire Indo-Pacific region. There will be large number of initiatives that will emerge. Some even called plurilaterals, some multilateral. All these arrangements combined together may be able to resolve some of the contradictions, but not all the contradictions. And if we look at the Quad from that perspective, that this is one among many other initiatives which will sort of, tie up, not work exclusively, but has to tie up with other institutions to bring about some kind of, resolution of all these contradictions. They will not be able to remove all the contradictions, but some kind of resolution in terms of at least trying to deal with the emerging issues in this region. And in fact, China is not helping at all. Unless China reduces its aggression, reduces its sort of, bellicosity in the region, it may not be possible for any other countries to deal with these issues. Yes, economic institutions, trade and investment relations, but eventually, although economics is the most important factor, but there is also a political sort of, dimension to that, a strategic dimension to that. So, it's a difficult situation altogether, but to zero in on anything would be extremely difficult at this stage. Who knows, maybe in future, at least. COVID might teach some lessons to many of these people, but one doesn't know. Even the doctors don't know.
I've mainly stated everything, except that one more from what you said, in terms of ASEAN centrality and whether ASEAN can be the decision maker in this or not. As we understand, because as far as RCEP is concerned, it was also considered to be an ASEAN central process, that is, the centrality of ASEAN was considered to be maintained there. Not in terms of ASEAN being the decision maker, but the easiest to negotiate with, or a centralized force, that would make others, the negotiation process simpler, So I think centrality has to be looked at from that perspective rather than from the perspective of ASEAN being the central force that is going to be the decision maker of the formulation. I think that one would like to bring in here.
This could be possible in economic negotiations, but on strategic and military issues or political issues, the negotiation becomes a bit difficult because economics has its own dynamics, and then strategic and politics have their other forms of dynamics. And negotiations becomes much more difficult in the case of strategic issues. Whereas on economic issues, one could sort of give in and take. But on strategic issues, it becomes difficult. Anyway, to Ambassador Raghavan.
No, Professor Ghoshal, you're absolutely right in what you said towards the end particularly. You know, I would like to remind everyone that ASEAN, when ASEAN centrality was talked about, ASEAN was 6 countries. Because ASEAN was a Cold War configuration. And ASEAN centrality, and that also it comes to the other, all the ASEAN-centric institutions that Professor Batra mentioned. All of these are Cold War constructs. And let us remember what was the objective of that. And that was also Asia-Pacific. I mean, this is one reason why Asia-Pacific is something that India hates. Because India is not part of the Asia-Pacific. When you defined Asia-Pacific, you defined it as ASEAN westwards. Sorry, ASEAN eastwards. So all these ASEAN-centric institutions were formed during the Cold War. They were formed with that Cold War objective in mind. And the Cold War objective, and that this is where the entire scenario has changed. The Cold War objective was America along with China. And you mentioned that ASEAN deferring to China was something that suited the Americans at that time, because the Americans had co-opted China into the task of dealing with the bigger shaitan, which was the USSR at that time. So the whole structure there in this region was a Cold War construct. And now what we are trying to do is to, I mean, if we talk about continuing the same structures, then you're talking about trying to use a structure built for one purpose, for an entirely different purpose when the whole scenario has changed. Today, China is the bigger threat, and China and Russia are allied together in many ways. So we are talking about a different construct. And that is why it is very difficult for that construct to deliver solutions in what we are trying to do. And as you said, you know, consensus is the killer of any progressive decision, almost everywhere. So you're looking at different kinds of institutions, and that is why, you know, we come to it. Only thing is, one should not look at any institution as an exclusive institution. I think that is the important lesson in international politics today, because today you do not have the settled world order that you had during the Cold War. Cold War was wonderful. I mean, it was wonderful in one sense. There was these 2 blocks, and you belong to one or the other. At most, you were an online country, so you had these 3 different groupings. Now, today, you have a complete mess. You know, you have, I think Ambassador Shivshankar Menon has this description of it. He says it is militarily unipolar, economically bipolar, and politically confused. I mean, that's the world order you're looking at. You're really looking at a world order which is trying to succeed the bipolar world order that existed during the Cold War, and it hasn't happened. And all of us are jostling around in that world to increase our own influence and to increase our own political and economic weight in that. And then I think what we are seeing is the result of that.
Yes, but what I can do is to, you know, summarize the entire discussion in a few words, a few sentences rather. I think all of us agreed that the Quad, the main thrust of our discussion this afternoon, is an important development, or an emerging development amongst many other developments that are taking place to deal with this confused and uncertain world. But a lot has to be looked into, because devil lies always in his details. That how this institution or this understanding functions in contradiction to other institutions, or in collaboration, or in consonance with other institutions. That needs to be looked into. From India's perspective, I think some of its major strengths that we have already identified in terms of America's and other countries' recognition of our contribution to these vaccines and in dealing with the health crisis and COVID-19. But in terms of the economic content of any kind of cooperation, India suffers from certain weaknesses. And if India has to make any major contribution to the development of any future institutions that deals with the emerging world order, India's economy needs to be strengthened. India's Atmanirbhar initiative could be just the beginning, but that may not be the end. It has to be tied up with other concrete actions in terms of reforming institutions, reforming economy of the country, and taking up the challenge much more coherently rather than in a lopsided manner. I think the last word would be how far India can emerge as a 5 trillion economy. That would really determine the future course of discourse on many of the things, even Quad. If that happens, maybe a lot of things will fall in place. With that, I think I would thank all the participants. And this has been a very interesting discussion. And we did it threadbare without pursuing any particular point of view. We tried to take into account all other points of view in evaluating the success, merits, demerits, and all other problems that come with Quad. Thank you all.